In my house, I have a painting painted by my father. In the painting, I am a little boy of about 3 years old. I am standing in a field of grass, holding and smelling a flower. My father did this painting from a photograph my grandmother had taken of me in her backyard. Although in the painting, I'm in the backyard of my dad's art gallery in Boothbay Harbor, Maine, because he would do that. Take different images and compose them into a painting where he had the things in there together that he liked. My dad was an artist and an art professor and made a career out of beauty, teaching people how to draw and paint in the history of art, and he drew and he painted a lot. I'm not sure people would consider his work masterpieces, but it was pretty good, and he sold quite a few of his drawings and paintings. Once in Boothbay Harbor, I sold one of his paintings 3 times in one morning. I didn't know he had sold it once already, and I sold it again. When somebody came in, he didn't put a sticker on it that said it was sold. And then later in the day, I told him that. We called both people up, asked if they'd both be okay with one of the two, and they were, sure, that's fine. And so when another person yet came in and said, oh, too bad that's sold, I'd like to buy that, my dad said, well, I can make you one. So he was a guy who made a lot of beauty, made a lot of art, did a lot of creating, and in addition to being a professor, made some kind of living at it too. He did a whole lot of work with teaching others to be art teachers because his university had a teaching program. So I kind of grew up understanding what the masterpieces of art were and kind of how artists worked. And yet, because my dad was an artist who drew and he painted, I did not want that to be my thing. So I took up music instead, and I figured whatever masterpiece I was going to do was going to involve an electric guitar. And I thought that until I got about to college and realized I was not going to be a rock star. But then I discovered writing, and I started to write about music in the arts. And while some of my friends worked their way through college being waiters or working in a retail store or fast food store, I worked for the newspapers. And I wrote record reviews and movie reviews and reviews of local theater and interviewed any artist of any name who might have come through the Fitchburg or Leominster area. And that's how I made my money. And I did as well or better than my friends working their part-time jobs. Got to meet James Taylor and a couple other, rather neat people you wouldn't think would make a performance stop in that little area of the state. And I thought, this will be my masterpiece. I was going to be Cameron Crowe. And then I got involved in human rights work and volunteerism and activism. And when the time came to apply for our college's internship slot at Rolling Stone magazine, I turned it down and went to the internship at Amnesty International and worked on human rights stuff instead. But I never give up writing. I figured somehow I was still going to write a lot. And eventually, I would write lots of stuff. I've had essays published in academic journals and pastoral journals. I've published a novel. Not quite a masterpiece, probably, but I am making $300 or $400 a year on it from Amazon, so, some people are reading it. And I realized after a while that all this artistic creation work I thought was going to be my masterpiece wasn't the masterpiece I ended up creating. I ended up creating the masterpiece that each of us ends up creating. I ended up creating my life. And my masterpiece of my life, it involved being a musician and being a writer and a student and an activist And ultimately it involved being a husband and a father and someone who was divorced and a guy who made pizzas in a pizza shop and a high school teacher and a minister. And that's all in the painting. And I paint it, and I sing it, and I dance it. And you have a work of art just like this called your life. And you paint it and write it and sing it and dance it. You may not think of yourself as an artist who is constantly working on a wonderful masterpiece, which is you. You may not think this because you think I'm not creative or I don't create things. You may think this because your life isn't all that special. Well, there's something I've learned in my years in the ministry is that if you talk to people enough, you will find that virtually every single person you run into in your life has a story. And that story is usually as good as any novel or movie anybody could make, and it's yours. And it has parts you love, and parts that make you cry, and parts that are just heart-wrenching, and parts that are just full of joy. And it's all part of that same work. One of my dad's favorite mediums was watercolors. And the great thing about watercolors, he would tell his students, is you can never make a mistake in a watercolor. Because you just take a lot of water and you just wash it out till the color's basically gone and you paint over it. And I would watch him demonstrate this to his classes. He'd have classes outside in the spring and summer, take them to local ponds and parks, and they'd all paint. And he would say, you know, I can teach anybody to draw and to paint. It's a physical skill. It's like learning to write your name or learning to use a hammer or a screwdriver. It's a physical skill. You can learn how to do it. But he'd say, what I can't teach you how to do is see. I can't teach you how to see the beauty that you see. I can't teach you how to be the wonderful person you are. That you have to believe in yourself. And I encourage you to do so. And he'd tell that to his painting classes. And therefore, he told it to me over and over and over. I'd heard this, every year. And I thought about that a lot as I would create things. And I tried to stay away from drawing again, because that was, his thing. And I never thought I drew well, because I always had my dad there to compare it to, right? And he's a pro, and I was a kid. So drawing wasn't my thing. But my brother and I, both of us, loved coloring. And guess what was forbidden in our house growing up? Coloring books. Draw your own pictures. After my parents got divorced, one of the first things my mom did was buy me and my brother coloring books. I think it did help mitigate the sting a little bit, actually. But there was this tendency for me, and I think for all of us, to see ourselves in comparison to other people's beauty, other people's lives, other people's creations. And we really shouldn't. All of us create, and all of our art is beautiful and gorgeous. In her book, Young at Art, Susan Stryker says, most of us suffered as children from ignorance in the education system about the significance of art and child development. Our parents and teachers gave us coloring books, mine didn't, so that we could produce the realistic pictures they thought we should be making. As a parent, you have an obligation to your child to do better than that. You don't have to be a doctor to look after your child's health. You don't need to be an artist to help your child develop into a healthy adult who has learned how to think critically and creatively and solve problems, and actively participate in age-appropriate art activities as an effective and enjoyable way to develop those skills. Throw out the coloring books and stencils. My father, God rest his soul, is now cheering at me. Let your child be a child and develop in the way that nature intended that person that your child is to develop. All of us, I think, internalize this message, One, that we are not beautiful, and two, that we don't create beauty. And both are horrible, immense lies. We are not beautiful enough. Our work isn't good enough. It is fake news. And isn't it? It's fake news. We're taught and we internalize it. If we don't dance like ballerinas, if we don't draw like my dad, if we don't paint like Georgia O'Keeffe, if we don't play the piano like Carol, if we don't sing like Hannah, we shouldn't bother. We're not good enough. But that's a lie. John Lennon once said, a musician is someone inspired to make noise. It may not be the most beautiful symphony you've ever heard, but darn it, that person's still a musician. And whatever banging or wailing they're doing is from their soul and from who they are. Yet, we get this constant message growing up, and we keep it as adults, that if it's not good enough, we shouldn't do it. And it crushes us. It stops us from seeing beauty in the world around us, and it stops us from seeing ourselves as the beautiful people we are. In a sense, it stops us from enriching our lives and having the fullest, most beautiful lives we can. When I began teaching high school, I noticed that a teacher who I thought was a pretty cool person and had a great reputation with the students had this poem pinned to her bulletin board behind her desk in her science lab classroom. And I eventually made a copy of it that I've kept ever since. And if you're in education, you may have run across it, because I think teachers I've run into over the years have known of it. And it said this: he always wanted to say things, but no one understood. He always wanted to explain things, but no one cared. So he drew. Sometimes he would just draw and it wasn't anything. He wanted to carve it in stone or write it in the sky. He would lie out on the grass and look up at the sky, and it would be only him and the sky and the things inside him that needed saying. And it was after that he drew the picture. It was a beautiful picture. He kept it under his pillow and let no one see it. He would look at it every night before he fell asleep and think about it. And when it was dark and his eyes were closed, he could still see it. It was all of him, and he loved it. When he started school, he brought the picture with him, not to show anyone, just to have with him, like a friend. It was a funny thing about school. He sat in square brown desk, like all the other square brown desks. He thought the desk should be red. And his room was a square brown room like all the other rooms. It was tight and close and stiff. He hated to hold the pencil and the chalk with a stiff arm and his feet flat on the floor, stiff, with a teacher watching and watching. And then he had to write the numbers. And they weren't anything. They were worse than the letters, which could be something if you strung them all together. The numbers seemed tight and square, and he hated the whole thing about the numbers. The teacher came to him and told him to wear a tie like the other boys. He said he didn't like wearing ties, and she said it didn't matter. After that, they drew. He drew all yellow, and it was the way he felt about the morning, and it was beautiful. And the teacher came and smiled at him and said, "What's this?" "Oh, yellow. Why don't you draw something like Ken's drawing? Isn't that beautiful?" After that, his mother bought him a tie, and he always drew airplanes and rocket ships like the other boys. And he threw away the old picture, and when he lay out alone looking at the sky, it was big and blue and all of everything, but he wasn't anymore. He was square inside and stiff. And he was like everyone else. And the things inside him that needed saying didn't need it anymore. It had stopped pushing. It was crushed, stiff, like everything else. So much in the world is ugly: disease, violence, war, discrimination, hate, and every ism you can think of. And I think we not only become numb to the ugliness and overwhelmed by it, but I think we also become numb to and lose sight of beauty. And there's a lot of it, and it's beautiful. And we get drummed into us that we are not beautiful and things are not beautiful, and just get your numbers drawn and just get a tie and just sit with your feet on the floor like everyone else. The American poet W.H. Auden wrote, "As a rule, it was the pleasure haters that became unjust." I think those who deal in ugliness can't see beauty, and therefore they don't know pleasure. They don't know the beauty and pleasure of art or living or the creative endeavor of just being human. I think oppression and denial of beauty and pleasure goes hand in hand. And it has created cultural norms that are vastly unhealthy for us. If you don't draw perfectly, don't draw. Art isn't a way to make a living. Sex is dirty. Laughter should be muted and reserved. But that's fake news. Beauty is actually a cure for the world, and so is pleasure. I think religion is the stories we tell ourselves that explain to us who we are, where we come from, where we ought to be going, what we value, and why. Each of our stories is a sacred story, and it's beautiful. When we tell our stories together, and we share them and hear them and listen to them and enter into them, we create a story together by joining our own stories, by joining our beauty with the beauty of others. We create two masterpieces, our own life and the life we create in community with each other. It's not perfect, but it doesn't need to be perfect to be a masterpiece. You don't need to draw like my dad or write like Stephen King to create. In their book, Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard, Chip and Dan Heath say that when you're at the beginning, don't obsess about the middle, because the middle is going to look different when you get there. Just look for a strong beginning and a strong ending and keep moving through the middle. Somewhere along the way, each of us has some or all of that artist's journey taken away. We're steered away from it, told not to go there, told don't begin that journey until you know what the finished product is going to look like. And all I hear my dad saying is, you can never make a mistake with a watercolor, you just wash it out and keep going. Perhaps the place we all stop being artists and stop being creative with our lives is that yearning to create something in the first place, to dream, to see the vision in our heart. It's the place where we want to try so hard, and yet we're afraid that if we don't do well or the results aren't good, then we will be criticized or laughed at or put down or shamed. And we have to resist that with every fiber of our being, because life is an ongoing, iterative work of art. We don't bother to stop living if life can't be exactly the way we want it or hoped it would be. Because then we dry up and become stiff inside and throw the drawings away. Remember that you are a good and beautiful creation, and what you create will be good and beautiful. A few years ago, British writer Neil Gaiman gave a commencement address at which he told the class the answer to everything in life is to make good art. He says, when things get tough, make good art. Someone runs off with your husband, make good art. Your leg gets crushed and eaten by a mutated boa constrictor, make good art. The IRS is on your tail, make good art. Your cat explodes, make good art. Someone on the internet thinks what you do is stupid or evil or wrong or it's all been done before, make good art. Probably things will work out somehow, and eventually time will take the sting away from everything. But that doesn't matter. Do what you do best. Make good art. And make it on the days when things go right, too. So, make of your life a masterpiece. We welcome a child today, a beginning in beauty and splendor. And I really wish I could guarantee there will be no difficulty and no pain in his very young life. But I can't. I can't guarantee Nash Bryan Kelly that he is and always will be in the place of love he is right now today. That sometime along the way things might go wrong and there's going to be pain and he's going to need to wash it all out like the rest of us and paint over. But I can guarantee that continuing on with the making of art in his life will make it grand. It will be amazing. It will be a sacred story and a masterpiece. Just like yours, just like mine. So go forth from here today and continue to create your masterpiece.